Well, good afternoon and welcome to this webinar at the Mile End Institute. My name is Robert Saunders and I am the co-director of the Mile End Institute, and it's wonderful to be able to welcome so many of you here today. We have, I think, nearly 400 people signed up for this event, which is a mark both of the excellence of our panel and perhaps of the level of public concern about this topic. Today's session forms part of a series that we've been running at the Mile End Institute on the future of British democracy. And we've been exploring some of the challenges confronting the British state and thinking about how we can protect and uphold our democracy in the future. So in previous events, we've explored the reform of judicial review and the case for an impartial civil service. In 2 weeks' time, we'll be looking at the ever popular topic of reform of the House of Lords. But today, we're focusing not on an institution, but on an acid that eats away at all of our institutions, and that is corruption. Politically speaking, corruption is like crime. It is a challenge for all political institutions at all points in history. But it's perhaps a particular menace for a democracy, because part of the point of democracy is that it separates political power from social or economic power. So if the rich or the powerful are able to corrupt the political system, whether that's by corrupting legislators or the electorate or the flow of information, then that strikes at the heart of what democracy is for. But of course, the tools of corruption change over time. In the 19th century, they might involve bribing voters or blackmailing politicians. Today, the challenges might involve dark money, cronyism, or digital disinformation. So we'll be asking whether Britain's electoral laws are still fit for purpose in an age of Facebook and Cambridge Analytica, whether well-funded lobby groups exert too much influence, and whether scandals over procurement, particularly during the COVID emergency, might require new forms of oversight. We'll be assessing the case for reforming public appointments, access to ministers, and the revolving door between government and the private sector. To debate these issues, we're joined by three wonderfully well-qualified panelists, and I know that we also have some very knowledgeable people with us in the audience. So each of our panelists will make some introductory remarks, and I'll then chat to them individually about some of the issues that they've raised. And then when all three panelists have spoken, I'll open up a more general discussion, and I'll put some of your own comments and questions to the panel. So please do write your questions in the chat box. You can do that at any time, or you can tweet them using the hashtag MEICorruptionUK. So our first speaker is the journalist and writer, Peter Geoghegan. Peter is the investigations editor at the award-winning news website Open Democracy. And earlier this year, he published a hugely important book called Democracy for Sale, and I have a prop ready to hand. And this book explores the role of dark money and digital disinformation in undermining democratic politics. And it really is, I think, essential reading for anyone who wants to understand how the terms of politics are being rewritten in ways that make new forms of corruption possible. So Peter, it's wonderful to have you with us. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward very much to hearing you speak.
Thank you very much, Robert. It does feel like quite a propitious moment to kind of have this session, to be talking about the kind of things I'm interested in, which is kind of how our electoral systems can be debased and can be kind of eroded, and how money can seep into the political process in ways we don't understand. Because obviously we're talking a week after an American election in which the president has still not accepted his defeat and has been spreading huge amounts of rumours and allegations around voter fraud and voter malfeasance, and really undermining the political process in the United States in lots of ways. And I've got good news and bad news, I think, for everybody in the call. One is that, you know, in general, in Western democracies, fraud and kind of problems with electoral politics don't manifest themselves inside polling stations and account centres. Really, we don't have an issue with the counting of votes. So if you look at the 2017 general election in Britain, we had, I think, one person was convicted. There was about 40 odd allegations of voter impersonation and one conviction. So, you know, blessed relief, actually counting votes isn't a real problem for us. The problem, unfortunately, though, is outside of the polling station, and that's where a lot of the kind of issues that I write about in my work, and I think are really salient now in 21st century politics, come from. And just kind of to give you a bit of a sense, I'll talk a little bit about dark money and disinformation for a couple of minutes, and then we can move on. But what a lot of people wonder, what does dark money mean? What does this terminology mean? And really what it is, it's a phrase that comes from America. And in the same way that we're looking to America now to think about, well, voter fraud, we often look at America when it comes to general aspects of regulating our politics and how our politics works here in Britain. And dark money refers to any kind of financial kind of inducements that get into the political process in ways that we can't see. So the kind of anonymous money that flows into the political process. That can go in lots of different ways. Sometimes it can be political donations made to kind of very shady campaign groups that don't really have any kind of footprint. It can be money that's given to what are called unincorporated associations, which are basically don't have very little legal standing, but can give money to political parties. It can be things like buying ads anonymously on the internet. It can be things like think tanks and lobby groups who are funded by anonymous backers who then go on to lobby politicians in ways that we can't see. So there's lots of ways in which money can kind of flow into the political process. And like in America, British politics runs on money. It's nowhere near as much money as America. When I first started doing this work, I've been doing this work for 3 or 4 years. Initially, I thought Britain can't really have much of a problem to do with money in politics because there's just not that much money. You know, in America, the American election has just gone. The presidential election alone cost $6.6 billion. The 3 campaigns around it for the Senate, the House, and the presidential campaign came to $14 billion. These are huge sums of money. In Britain, the last general election, the Conservatives raised about £40 million, and that was a record amount before a general election. But as I've started doing more and more work in this, I've realized that actually, because there's less money floating around, but British politics does rely on private money and private donations, it actually means the opportunities for lobbying and for influence are much greater because you have a much smaller cohort of people who give money to politics. So you're constantly trying to induce those people to give and put money into the political system. And we've seen this happen even quite a lot, even just in recent months. We had the case of Robert Jenrick, the housing minister, who has admitted what was called apparent bias in overturning a planning decision that benefited Richard Desmond, who's a Conservative donor, having sat next to him at a Conservative Party fundraiser. And in the wake of that, one of the business ministers was on the Today programme and was asked about this and said, well, there's not really a problem with this. Anyone can go and pay to go to a Conservative Party fundraiser, and you too can kind of sit next to the relevant minister and might be able to get influence. So we can see how kind of money can work into the political process in that way. And it's not really in many ways a new thing. British politics has always relied on money. We actually know more about it than we used to do because we do have better disclosures for legitimate donations. The problem is what we're seeing, I think, is more and more aspects of money that's dark. So illegitimate is not quite the right word for, but money that we can't track and trace. So I've spent a lot of time kind of trying to understand that. And one aspect, as you mentioned, is online and digital disinformation. So, for example, in the run-up to last year's general election, 2019 general election, hundreds of thousands of pounds were spent by what were supposed to be grassroots campaign organisations, groups with names like Capitalist Worker and things like this, mainly on the Conservative side of politics, some on the Labour side of politics, buying lots and lots of adverts on the internet. And what's interesting about this is because they're third-party campaigns, they're not connected to official campaigns. The declarations, no one really makes much kind of cares that much about how they declare. So in theory, these groups should all be declaring how much money they've spent and where they've got it from. It's really, really porous. There isn't the same oversight for non-political campaigns as there is for official campaigns. And why this matters is because as I think we can all really feel, in recent years, politics has become far more voracious, I think, of time and space. It's less become something that just happens through political parties at certain times in the run-up to elections. Increasingly, we're seeing these kind of ginger groups popping up. There's lots more kind of plethora of different groups who are campaigning around certain issues, but also political campaigning has stopped being something that just happens at election time, but it happens all across the piece. And why that matters is because a lot of the way our laws are written presuppose a bunch of very specific things around politics, around elections. One is that they're all written before the digital age, really. So, for example, in Britain, if you are a campaigner and you give someone a leaflet ahead of election, it has to have a little imprint on it who says who you are and who've paid for this leaflet. If you want to put an advert on the internet, you don't have to do any of those things. So the kind of standards that we have for offline campaigning haven't been adopted for online campaigning. But that's not the only problem. If it was just a matter of tinkering with some of those rules, that would be fine. But actually, the way we conceive of politics is this thing that just happens in months around an election by kind of legitimate, kind of easily identifiable political actors. That's really, really changed in recent years. And one of the ways I kind of chart that as well is the influence of think tanks in British politics, kind of think tanks who don't declare their political donations specifically. So we've got, there's always been research institutes and research organizations to go around politics, providing advice and ideas about what's happening. But what I think we've seen in recent years, especially in the wake of the Brexit referendum, is that kind of think tanks who don't declare their funders, anonymously funded think tanks who are closely aligned with political positions espoused by kind of certain aspects of government, have become increasingly influential. So they're able to produce things like policy papers that get picked up by government. They're cited in Parliament by either government ministers or backbench ministers who want to have particular political ends. They are kind of very, very ubiquitous on the media, because the media has changed so much. It requires far more voices. And I think we can all see this too. Whereas 20 years ago, there wasn't the same 24/7 rolling news. So kind of think tanks provide a very useful function there. And this would all be fine, I think, if there was a sense in which these were independent bodies which were transparent about their funding. But a lot of these organizations, or almost most of them, don't actually have to declare where their funders are. They're charities, and they don't have to declare where their money comes from. And the problem then arises where corporate donors, which is what's happened, are able to kind of feed into the political process, again, in a dark way, using dark money by funding think tanks who don't declare their donors. Then they're able to lobby government. So it's not hard to see how that kind of malfeasance can then start to play a role in politics, especially when our laws are quite porous around us and things are changing quickly. And one of the other aspects I think is really important, and I touched on there, was the online space. And this has been I think is one of the things that supercharges kind of role of dark money in British politics. Because initially what we meant by dark money in America was in the 70s, people like the Koch brothers spent loads of money on things like research institutes, think tanks, to put policy proposals out into the public domain and into the political agenda, because they realized that rather than trying to buy political campaigns, it was better to buy the idea space. And we've seen that happening in Britain now, but at the same time, we've also seen that coupled with this rise of kind of a very, very new type of digital politics. And I think it's really easy for us to forget just how quickly things are changing. We look back to almost a year ago, the UK general election. In the run-up to that, we had the Conservatives rebrand their Twitter account as a fact-checking account during a live debate, and then kind of double down on it. And I think that's really, really important to kind of understand and to see. These are kind of manifestations of political change that are almost happening so quickly and are allowing different ways of kind of doing politics, which I do think can tend towards a kind of corrupt view of politics in ways that we haven't really seen, and we can often not acknowledge fully just how kind of deep and difficult and kind of dangerous in some ways this murky new world is.
Great, thank you very much, Peter. You've given us an enormous amount to think about there. Just to follow up on something you write about in your book, you have a really remarkable chapter on the Democratic Unionist Party and the Brexit referendum of 2016, when you explain that the DUP spent more money on that referendum than on any previous campaign in its history. It spent most of that money outside Northern Ireland, and it's still very difficult to get to the bottom of where that money actually came from. Can you explain very briefly how that was possible and why we should be worried?
Yeah, I was going to start with that story, because that's normally, whenever I do one of these panel discussions, it's normally kind of story 101 is the DUP story. And I decided this time I won't. So I'm really glad you asked it. And so basically what happened was my work in this area, in this book in many ways, came out of when I was a reporter in 2016 covering the referendum. I was in Sunderland a few days before the referendum doing that thing that journalists are often sent by news editors to do. I was working for the Irish Times. Would you go and write a colour piece about what's happening with the Brexit vote in this kind of a city that a lot of readers wouldn't know about? And when I was leaving Sunderland, I noticed I picked up a copy of the Metro, the free newspaper, and had a big advert in the front of it that said, "Take back control," which is the Vote Leave slogan. And on the back, it had the DUP's little logo. The line had a DUP, and I'd worked in Belfast. I knew the DUP, and I actually also knew a bit about Northern Irish electoral law. And I thought this was curious, because I was aware that political donations in Northern Ireland were kept secret because of the violence and the Troubles. So there was kind of a loophole in British election law that a few people were aware of, and never really written about, because loopholes become interesting when they're abused. And what was interesting about the Brexit referendum was because it was one constituency. The whole United Kingdom was one constituency. So normally the general election is 650 constituencies. So even if Northern Irish donations are secret, there's not that much you can do with it, because it's very hard to get money from a Northern Irish constituency to the rest of the United Kingdom. And so basically I kind of thought about, I kind of was very interested in this, and I found myself digging around a lot more into just what had been going on with the DUP and how they'd come to end up buying this really expensive advert. And the long story short was, it turns out the DUP received £450,000, or £435,000 to be precise, for its Brexit campaign. And that money was given to the DUP through a thing called the Constitutional Research Council, which sounds really grand. It sounds like something might have an office in Pall Mall and lots of people doing very important research. But actually, it's one of these things called an unincorporated association, which in many ways is kind of like, it's kind of, in terms of it's a legal fiction is being unkind, but it doesn't have any legal standing. You know, an unincorporated association doesn't have to file company accounts. It doesn't have to list its members. It doesn't list where its money comes from. But this money that came to DUP came through this tiny, tiny group called the Constitutional Research Council, who'd never donated to politics before, who's only ever donated to the European Research Group afterwards. But they were run by a man called Richard Cook, who was a former Conservative Party serial candidate in Glasgow. He'd lost a number of times. And I ended up kind of looking into this man as well, and finding out he had a very checkered business history that raised a lot of red flags. He got into business with the head of Saudi secret intelligence shortly after leaving politics, and had a lot of kind of question marks about it. But because of this Northern Irish secrecy, we were never able to find out what happened. But interestingly, in 2017, shortly after the new government came into power, and they required the Democratic Unionist Party votes to stay in power, Theresa May, back under the confidence supply arrangement, it was decided they would actually finally bring donor transparency into Northern Ireland. And under the legislation, it was possible to backdate that to the start of 2014. And the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee had a meeting to discuss this. But it ended up voting on party lines, Conservative versus Labour, and instead of backdating it, which is what would have everybody in Northern Ireland was aware this is possible, instead of backdating it, which would have given transparency to this donation, they decided just to bring in political transparency from that point forward. So remarkably, 4 years on, more than 4 years on, we still don't know where the biggest donation in Northern Irish political history actually came from, or who was behind it. And I think that kind of speaks, and the size of the amount of money, as you say, the DUP had spent about £50,000 on the Stormont campaign they won 6 weeks before the Brexit referendum. So then they emerged spending almost 10 times as much. And in somewhere like Britain, where, you know, there aren't huge amounts of spending, you know, the Leave campaign was fined. It broke the law during the referendum by overspending by almost £500,000. It was fined the maximum fine in British election law, which is the princely sum of £20,000. So, but you can see that gives you a sense that actually what to American audiences would sound like small amounts of money can actually make a huge impact in Britain.
Thank you. And just very briefly, money is obviously a key issue that runs through your book, but another is technology. And you have a very striking line where you say the misuse of technology is an existential threat to democracy. What are you most concerned about there?
Well, I think we're almost seeing that in the last week. If you look at what we're seeing around, or in the weeks leading up to this, if you look at what's happened in America, you know, it's quite clear there's a huge amount of online disinformation in the run up to the American election. You know, there's been some really interesting reading from Miami and writing from Miami-Dade, which was this county that swung very strongly to Donald Trump and basically gave Donald Trump Florida. Huge amounts of disinformation targeting particularly Cubans and Venezuelans in Miami-Dade with the intention of kind of swinging their votes. The capacity for online disinformation to target voters is huge, but also what we're seeing is the power of online technology to just shift the political conversation over the last week. You know, we saw things like the Steal the Vote campaign, which emerged on Facebook and ran for a couple of days before Facebook closed it down, had hundreds of thousands of members. And around the same time, we saw people on the streets of America, you know, kind of campaigning and canvassing. But also the online space and online conspiracy theories can very quickly seed into politics. So you've seen, you know, Donald Trump, many things that Donald Trump has read out as things that have happened actually originate on message boards or on Facebook or on other social media sites. And I think it's really difficult to, like, the way this is transformed, not just the medium, but also the message by which politics is done is really huge. And, you know, and tech companies have so far shown a huge resistance to actually doing anything about it. Like Facebook allowed the QAnon theory to propagate for almost 3 years before it did something about it, which suggests, you know, and that's a theory in which, you know, people have died as a consequence of that. And the idea that, you know, Donald Trump is fighting a cabal of international pedophiles.
Thank you. Well, lots that we'll come back to later in the discussion, but I'd like to turn now to our second speaker, and we're delighted to be able to welcome Margaret Hodge MP. Margaret is the Labour MP for Barking, and from 2010 to 2015, she was chair of the Public Accounts Committee. And in that role, she led major investigations into tax avoidance by international companies, the relationship between Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs and the big accountancy firms, and waste in public procurement. And she made the Public Accounts Committee one of the most visible select committees, and talks about her work in another of my props, her 2016 book, Called to Account. So thank you very much for joining us, Margaret, and over to you.
Thank you, Peter. And I've got to apologize because I've got handwritten notes, so I shall probably not be looking at you in the eye as much as I should do normally. I want to put a context on this because I'm often asked as the ex-chair of the PAC to speak at seminars that are organised by the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association for Commonwealth politicians. And I'm supposed to talk to them. The presumption behind that, my talks is that unlike all the Commonwealth countries, there's no corruption in the UK and its programmes, and our civil service and our public administration is the best in the world. And over time, the reality has become very, very different from the image that we're trying to portray. And over recent years, I think things have only got worse. Similarly, I often talk to tax audiences about tax justice. And the presumption there is that one of the reasons that we've got such a successful financial services sector here in the UK is because we're a trusted jurisdiction governed by the rule of law. And again, the reality is that we've become the jurisdiction of choice for every kleptocrat, criminal, money launderer in the world. And that is scary. And add to those two aspects, what's happened under the Boris Johnson government. I think that what the actions that they have taken have attacked the very fragile pillars of democracy, and which will opens us to greater malpractice and corruption. Just to say what I think that is, if you think the government's determination to weaken the judiciary after the successful challenge to proroguing of Parliament, the attack on the BBC and public service broadcasting with the review announced just the other day, the growing trend of ignoring Parliament and brushing aside accountability to Parliament and through Parliament to the public, the determination to undermine the rule of law with a proposition in the Internal Markets Bill, and what Peter's talked about, the increasing use of social media to promote fake news. All of that challenges our democracy and facilitates, in my view, the growth of malpractice leading to corruption. I'm going to focus on two particular issues from my experience, both at the Public Accounts Committee and more recently as chair of the APPG on responsible tax and anti-corruption. First, I want to look at the increasing abuse of power, political nepotism, serious conflicts of interest, and blatant corruption that I think are infecting our public services. And I think one of the reasons this has come about is because of the growing privatization of public services. When we looked at this in the Public Accounts Committee, and this is 2014-15, if you strip out of public expenditure what I call the transfer payments, so pension payments or child tax credits, all those sort of unemployment payments, and you just look at public services and public service delivery, at that time, and this is 2014-15, 50% of public services were delivered by the private sector. I think if we did that exercise today, we'd probably be closer to 70%. And that means you've got the growth of these monopolies, the Sercos, the G4Ss, the Capita, and you've almost got the growth of what I term a shadow state, where these organizations, these private companies have become too big to fail. Couple that with the way in which the civil service has been stripped bare, and a growing use of consultants, and inevitably, we're creating, I think, many dangers and certainly problems. Now, we all use our networks. When I was a minister and I got a new portfolio, I would of course consult all my networks of people who I knew something about it, and I'd consult stakeholders. But there's a spectrum that moves from sensible consultation and involvement to political cronyism, nepotism, serious conflicts of interest, and then corruption. And personal financial gain, together with the illegitimate use and abuse and concentration of power, I think are undermining our democracy. And let me use 3 examples. One is the use of consultants. It has spiraled. If you look at the COVID as the most recent time, there's endless data that bears that out. Consultants are being paid massive amount, 1.5 million pounds in annual salaries to, for example, improve test and trace. So we've got Bolton Consultancy charging £7,000 day rate, earning £40 million in 4 months. We've got Deloitte, 1,000 consultants on test and trace, a daily rate of nearly 2,500. And also they're working on the PPE contract, which is currently being investigated by the Health Select Committee. You've got KPMG, 60 consultants who built the now not very useful Nightingale hospitals, and again, charging an hourly rate of about £1,000 an hour. And compare that to civil service pay, just to see the waste. 1 in 5 civil servants earns under 20,000, 2 in 3 earn under 30,000, and less than 1% earn over 80,000. So not only is it terrible value for money, but also there's never a comeback if they do a bad job. There's no open competition in where these consultants get their work, and there's no transparency over their contracts. Indeed, things do get worse. Deloitte is now busy selling its so-called expertise to local authorities as they take over test and trace. And if I go to the tax world, which I looked at when I was chair of the Public Accounts Committee, there's 2 examples there. One is the government uses a forum called the Tax Professional Forum, in which it tests advice and tests propositions. Every single member of that forum was a professional who had a financial and professional interest in avoiding tax. So KPMG, Ernst & Young, BDO, Gray's in tax chambers. There wasn't an academic who might believe in tax justice. There were no development charities and no tax campaigners. And so the advice they got was very partisan. And I think my worst example of abuse of these jobs was a new tax relief that was introduced actually by the Labour government called the patent box. And the idea there was that to convert patents that had been developed into real businesses providing growth and jobs. Idea was good. It was one that Alistair Darling, I think, promoted. KPMG came in to do the technical advice around it. One of their partners spent 6 months in Treasury writing the legislation. After the 6 months, he went out of Treasury, back to KPMG, and immediately produced a brochure which said, patent box, what's in it for you? And he had devised the loopholes that were then exploited ruthlessly, and it didn't meet its tests. So the use of consultants is one thing, and it then leads to this revolving door syndrome, which we are useless at here. We just do not legislate sufficiently strongly on that issue. My great example was Dave Hartlett, who used to run used to be head of the HMRC. When he left office, in part because of evidence that we took from him at the Public Accounts Committee, within 6 months he was working for HSBC, and for 3 months after that he worked at Deloitte. More recently, Chris Grayling, the man who gave a ferry contract to a company who had no ferries, has taken a £100,000 contract with Hutchison Ports, who control a lot of our key major ports like Harwich and Felixstowe. And that was an appointment that was authorized by the committee that is supposed to be looking after this, the Advisory Committee on Business Appointments. And one of the things I get angriest about is a man called Liam Maxwell, who was the top tech advisor to the UK government. And he walked out of the civil service straight into a job with Amazon Web Services. And Amazon never pay their tax. The last year they turned over 13.7 billion and paid only 0.01% in corporation tax. And this branch of Amazon earned £45.5 million in contracts from government, of which a big chunk come from HMRC. So all this is, I think, inappropriate revolving doors, which brings us on to how the use of consultants fosters also political cronyism and nepotism. And I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to do this very quickly, which edges us more closely, I think, to the shady and potentially corrupt practices. Dido Harding, married to John Penrose, who is supposed to be our anti-corruption guru in Parliament, shares a passion with Matt Hancock for horses, now supposedly running not very competently the test and trace system. Kate Bingham, leading the National Vaccine Task Force, again married to a member of the government, and at the same time she's also managing private investment for 2 companies who are linked to the global effort to develop a vaccine. Yesterday in the papers, Philip Davis and Lawrence Robertson, 2 Conservative MPs, both taking contracts with gambling industry as the government embark on a review of the gambling industry. And Philip in particular took the job in August, pays him a lot of money, but didn't resign from the DCMS Select Committee. Not necessarily corrupt, but there's a financial benefit to all these individuals. There's no open competition, there's no transparency, and we just don't know. And then you look at the contracts. Sorry to go on, but shut me up, Peter, if I'm going on too long. Sorry, Robert, if I'm going on too long. But if you look at the contracts awarded, I think Test and Trace, if we look at that, Serco, who we investigated time and time again in the Public Accounts Committee, they ran a terrible contract in Cornwall for out-of-hours services for GPs, where somebody blew the whistle and their only response was to ransack the lockers of all the individuals employed there to see who it was who had blown the whistle. And they had been lying on their KPIs there. And then they were involved in the infamous electronic tagging contract for the Ministry of Justice, where they were claiming payment for prisoners who'd had their tags removed, who were back in prison, who'd left the country, and indeed prisoners who died. Anyway, they've made a mint out of the test and trace contract and operate badly a quarter of the testing sites. And if you look at PPE, this is a very important example. Ianda Capital got one of the PPE contracts to provide 200 million face masks. They're based in Mauritius, so they obviously don't pay their tax. And Andrew Miller, who negotiated the contract as a government advisor, it is alleged, also sits on the board of Ianda Capital as an advisor to them. All these companies become too big to fail. There's no transparency. And just my propositions for what should improve is, if you take a contract that is a public service contract, you should be open to inspection by the National Audit Office. We should be able to ask freedom of information questions in relation to that particular contract. We have to look at the capability of the civil service in administering, monitoring these contracts and letting them. We have to have proper competition, not this oligopoly of a very small number of players. And we have to have ethical standards, which include paying your tax. Finally, I'm going to briefly talk about my tax justice work, because I started there looking at tax avoidance. And at that time, we talked about anywhere between 30 billion to 120 billion pounds lost to the taxpayer from tax avoidance. But again, it became a spectrum of tax avoidance very quickly morphing into financial crime. And the figures there are appalling. The National Crime Agency, undoubtedly a conservative figure, believes that about 100 billion pounds is laundered annually into the UK. And the UK is at the heart of financial crime. If you look at the Panama Papers, half of the entities named in those papers are entities that are located in one of Britain's overseas territories, one of our tax havens, the British Virgin Isles. And more recently, the FinCEN files that were released, we found that 20% of the files that were mentioned there, again, were of companies incorporated in BVI. The route of Russian money coming into Britain is outrageous, £68 billion. And the routes into the property market in the UK is also outrageous. And just to take one example from the FinCEN file, Lyubov Chernykin, who is the wife of a Russian oligarch, she's donated £1.7 million to the Conservative Party, endless tennis games with both Johnson and Cameron. And she received, according to the FinCEN files, £8 million from a close associate of Vladimir Putin, who's been put on the sanctions list by the American authorities. And again, as we look at all this, I just want to give my 3 or 4 solutions. Transparency becomes key, whether it's public registers of beneficial ownership, public registers of property ownership in the UK, country by country reporting, unexplained wealth orders, or details of the individuals who actually own. We need a much tougher and well-resourced regulatory regime, which we haven't got. We need much better international cooperation. And again, we need the reform of the civil service. I've touched the tip of a large and growing iceberg. Many of the issues I haven't had the time to cover, but I hope the things I have raised will stimulate a debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much. A huge amount for us to think about there. That was wonderful. Just continuing very briefly, your suggestions for change at the end. You touched on the question of whistleblowers, and that's something that several people have raised in the questions. What can we do better? What can the law do better to protect whistleblowers?
Actually, I don't think it's the law. I think the framework of the law is probably tough enough now. No doubt that, there's some improvements on the margin. The difficulty is if you're a whistleblower in an organization, it's just impossible to go back into that organization and really be accepted as somebody. I mean, I started this whole work on tax avoidance from a whistleblower in HMRC talking to us about the sweetheart deal with Goldman Sachs. And I really tried hard to protect him. Every time we had the head of HMRC up giving advice, I'd say, are you looking after him? But in the end, life just got too unbearable and he moved on and retrained. I mean, this government is, I'm involved at the moment in a case of a whistleblower, and this is a whistleblower who's a British citizen who worked for a company that was based in Monaco, incorporated in Holland. Those complex regimes are very commonplace in financial crime. And this company built oil platforms, and he was the in-house lawyer. He went in there. He, after a few years, uncovered that they had actually obtained contracts from developing countries through a massive bribery network running into hundreds of millions of pounds. He blew the whistle, and there have been successful prosecutions in the UK, in America, in Brazil, and elsewhere. He comes back to the UK. The Monaco authorities are furious because this company is a big company based in Monaco. And unbeknown to him, they use the red notice extradition mechanism to try and get him back to Monaco to face trumped up charges. They don't serve it when he's living in the UK. They do serve it when he's in Croatia, where he has now been for over 100 days, trying to fight this extradition order to take him back to Monaco. And I have been trying, together with others, to get the Foreign Office to do a little bit of work in protecting a UK citizen and protecting a whistleblower. And actually, they have been totally, completely and utterly useless in taking any action, either with the Croatian authorities or the Monaco authorities, to drop the charges and to bring this guy home. So I think the legislation is okay. I don't think this government enforces as well as it could, but I think this is a very difficult area of public policy to create the environment in which people feel relaxed and happy to continue working for a particular organisation.
Well, thank you very much. I'd like to turn now to our third speaker, Professor Robert Barrington. Robert is superbly well qualified to talk about this subject because he is the Professor of Anti-Corruption Practice at the Centre for the Study of Corruption in the University of Sussex. Before that, he was the UK head of Transparency International, which is a leading anti-corruption NGO. And he campaigned to secure the Bribery Act, a national anti-corruption strategy, unexplained wealth orders, and other parts of the toolkit that we can use to tackle corruption. And I'm very pleased to say that he's written a blog post for us on the Mile End Institute website, and we'll put a link to that in the chat box. So thank you very much for joining us, Robert, and over to you.
Thank you, Robert. I'm going to cover inevitably some similar territory to what we've heard from Margaret and Peter, but maybe with a different lens on it. Modern anti-corruption analysis has been around for about 30 years, and it's complemented by data produced by organizations like the World Bank and Transparency International. And like most Western democracies, this has tended to show the UK relatively favorably. For example, the UK, even at the height of scandals where there was demonstrably corruption, like the BAE Systems case, remained in the top 20 of TI's Corruption Perceptions Index. So that picture has been challenged, and the challenges have tended to take one of two lines of argument to date. The first has been around financial crime, in which, building partly on research from Transparency International, it's been shown that the UK is, as a global financial centre, it's enabling other countries' corruption. For example, when a kleptocrat buys property in London or Surrey or the Highlands. And then there's a set of arguments around perhaps more ideological arguments, which see a correlation between inequality in the UK, the increased role of the private sector in the state, often described as neoliberalism, the dominance of the financial sector, and the links between politics and business. And this picture is viewed as a collective system that is somehow innately corrupt. And that line of argument draws fuel from the notion that there's a self-perpetuating establishment exemplified by appointments to the House of Lords, the proportion of the government who are educated at Oxbridge or independent schools, etc. I've always been a bit ambivalent about the question of the extent to which corruption pervades the UK, because I think all those arguments have merit. Those who point out that the UK is still a long way from being Russia or Afghanistan, set against the proven position of the UK as a global enabler of corruption, the inevitable cronyism of an embedded establishment, and some of the relationships between business and politics. So that has been a complex picture, and you can sort of choose where you stand ideologically or with regard to questions around financial crime and whether complicity is the same as committing the crime itself. But the conclusion I've reached recently is that those arguments don't matter very much anymore, because we no longer need a slightly obscure argument about whether the British establishment is innately corrupt, or an ideological debate about the inherent corruption of capitalism. Even without solving those arguments, we now have grounds to be very concerned indeed about corruption in the UK today. And my concern springs from a couple of areas. The first is that we see behaviours from within our own government that are, by any standards, indicators of corruption. The generic scandals, and they are plural, not singular, the rule breaking by Dominic Cummings, COVID-19 procurement cronyism, the government's willingness to break both our own laws and international laws, etc. In other words, when discussing corruption in the UK, we no longer need an ideological debate over the innate corruption of capitalism. We have a cluster of cases that either look like corruption or contain the ingredients typically found in a corrupt administration. And that should be very worrying. My second concern is that ways in which countries defend them against this are reasonably well established, and those that are present in the UK are either under threat or failing. And broadly, they consist of institutions which provide independence and checks and balances, such as the media, judiciary, parliament, the electoral system, and the civil service, all of which Margaret has just mentioned. But they also consist of norms of behaviour which are encapsulated in the Nolan principles. However, we've seen a government in which the ministers ignore the ministerial code and take a bellicose approach towards the media, including the BBC, the Electoral Commission, the Civil Service, Parliament, and the judiciary. So the only reason I don't yet call this out and out corruption is that I would like to see some more evidence, for example, about the generic pork barrelling. There's certainly sufficient evidence for him to have resigned already over the Richard Desmond property deal, but evidence of corruption, I'd like to see more information. And also whether the allocation of secret contracts during the pandemic has been disproportionately to Conservative supporters or inappropriately carried out. So we see all the indicators of corruption. The real evidence, may or may not be there, but as Margaret said, with greater transparency, we would be able to see it. So my fundamental point is that without yet having proven cases of corruption, the early warning signals are really flashing red for the UK. And in fact, the alarm bells are clanging so hard, we would be foolish to ignore them. I've got a section of solutions, both in the theoretical and realistic categories that I can talk about, but I know we're pushed for time. So I'll pause there, Robert, and let you draw in others or come back to me as you wish.
Great, thank you very much. A very interesting question has just come into the chat box from Paul Hayward, who says there's an understandable emphasis on transparency as a part of tackling these issues, but actually all of the things that we've talked about so far are already in the public domain. So should we be more concerned about why these stories aren't cutting through, or why they're not generating the kind of outrage that we might hope or expect?
Shall I have a first go at that?
Oh, yes, please. Yes.
I mean, I think it's an excellent question. And the truth is that transparency is only ever a part of solutions to either heading off corruption or tackling it when it's happened. And as I've indicated in that case of the generic pork barreling allegations, for example, we would need to know more about that, how the decision was made to allocate money to his constituency and the reciprocal arrangement to his ministerial colleagues' constituency. So transparency would help us know more, but it's not the solution. Transparency itself doesn't do anything. It just tells you what's happening. And so certainly you need some of the other things that Margaret was talking about. You need well-resourced enforcement. You need good legislation. You need a culture, ideally with leadership from the top, but also with a culture that is receptive amongst the wider public, in which people see when wrong things are happening and want something to be done about it. So you need a number of things to be in place. I've divided my solutions into theoretical and likely, because I think theoretical solutions we all know, and one of them, for example, is good leadership, or strong leadership that sets high standards. And frankly, we're not seeing that at the moment. So, there are some, it's slightly horses for courses, that in some circumstances, some solutions will work and in others will work. But we're not looking for solutions at the moment that require strong leadership setting high standards.
Can I come in, Robert?
Yes, of course.
I think I think it's a really good question. And I think it goes to the weakness of the other pillars of our democracy. I don't know if the other Robert agrees with this, and indeed Peter agrees with this. BBC too scared to actually report fully because they're worried about their future, or they're worried about their license fee. The judiciary, even the judiciary, slightly inhibited by the threat of a review. MPs, absolutely. I mean, Parliament is now, I think, weaker than it's been. I've been an MP for a very long time, and I like to think that the years under the coalition government in particular Parliament was quite strong. Now it's so weakened. The Tories that disagreed with the Leave camp, the Leavers, have just been, they've left the Tory party, and they were among those that were the most challenging to what was happening. So all those pillars have been weakened. And then just one other thing, I think for government accountability, the code of ministerial accountability is really central to this, and it's a difficult argument. At the moment, civil servants are only accountable to ministers, not directly to Parliament, and then the minister is accountable to Parliament. That is broke because it sometimes means that ministers get falsely accused of when things go wrong. I always think of the Charles Clarke example there, where he had to resign on the back of people not being deported, or civil servants fall because of actions of ministers. And I think there of Brodie Clark, who was in charge of immigration under Theresa May's time. And, you know, there'd been cuts to the immigration officer, so there were queues at Heathrow, and he took the brunt of that, although it was the decision of the cut. So it's a broke system. And if we could just stop that, you know, reform the code of ministerial accountability and have much more direct accountability through Parliament to the public, the media, all stakeholders, then of civil servants, where they could really be held to account for what they did. I think that would strengthen the transparency and give us an added tool to preventing corruption and malpractice.
Thank you. If I can come back to Robert for a moment. Some of the issues that we've been discussing are common to many democracies across the West, both in terms of the new kind of terrain that Peter has talked about, the rise of digital disinformation and dark money, but also in terms perhaps of a more populist political style and a greater contempt for institutions. Are there things that Britain can learn from other countries, either learning from their unhappy example, or perhaps learning from the kinds of protections and measures that other states have taken to respond to these kinds of pressures?
Yeah, I think there are two big things we can learn. And it's worthwhile saying that, you know, one of the challenges that democracies have faced has not simply been, you know, the rise of social media and the decline in standards and so on. It has also been populist politicians who are very happy to break the norms. And, you know, that has been a severe challenge, there's no doubt. So I see a couple of things happening. The first is that there has been a sort of narrative in the last few years that anti-corruption agencies are perhaps not very successful, because there are a number of developing countries in which they've rather failed. They've been captured by the people they were meant to be checking up on and so on. However, Australia have just announced that they're almost certain to have one. They're calling it an integrity commission, and France set one up a couple of years ago. So, you know, I think there's a question about whether we need to set up an agency like France and Australia, which looks specifically at corruption. And that brings me to my second point, which is there are some other countries which have broken through this thought process of thinking corruption happens overseas and often in poor countries, and it doesn't happen in our country. And I think as soon as you break through that barrier and you realize that corruption can and does also happen in the UK, then the set of solutions that you will put in place are going to look very different. And, you know, as long as you're thinking, well, corruption happens overseas, then most of your laws, as is the case with our UK Bribery Act and unexplained wealth orders, will be directed at foreigners doing nasty things rather than our own backyard. So, you know, I think our own backyard is important, and we need to break through psychologically to think corruption happens here, and it's happening here and now and in the UK. And, for example, an anti-corruption agency might be a suitable solution for that.
Thank you. And just to follow up on that, Robert, we've had a question that I think is easy to overlook, but is actually very important, which asks simply, why does corruption matter? Why is it a problem? We can see it's a moral problem, but is there any evidence that it actually produces worse outcomes for government?
Yeah, well, I would welcome anybody to sign up to our course at Sussex, the Masters in Corruption and Governance, in which there is a module on the victims of corruption and the harm it does. And, you know, it's a longer conversation than we can have now, but I think it's fairly well established that corruption has victims and does real harm. And there are a number of ways, and you see that certainly there is more often than not economic harm associated with corruption. There are real victims when you look at corruption, for example, in facilitating human trafficking. You can see individual victims. When you're looking at the political level, I think you're looking at something, you know, a little bit fuzzy, and that's why it's hard to pin down. It's also why it's really hard to put into legislation things like cronyism and the revolving door and so on, because demonstrating the harm is difficult if you're looking for a direct cause and effect between an individual moving, for example, from the Treasury into an accounting practice. I think what I would say is that the harm is, you know, well known and well proven, in pretty much every area. But when you get to political corruption, it becomes fuzzier, and you get into concepts like the undermining of democracy. I think we can all, sort of understand that that does harm, the undermining of democracy. But the cause and effect between individual actions and the undermining of democracy is often hard to show.
Thank you. We're getting lots of questions coming in now, so I'm going to bundle some questions together and invite each of you to respond to whichever of them you would like to do so. So please don't feel you have to answer all of them, but just respond to whichever you find most interesting. So firstly, how do we create the political will to tackle corruption, given that to some extent those at the top are likely to be those who are benefiting from it? So how do we incentivize people at the top of British politics to make this a priority? A second question is whether the state is now actually too small to control the kinds of forces that are corrupting our politics. If we're talking about great multinational firms like Facebook, or we're talking about the movement of capital across the globe, is this something actually that can now only be tackled by international action rather than by individual state action? And then thirdly, I think a really interesting question about perhaps how we prioritize these issues. And to what extent should we care about what the questioner calls petty corruption? And the questioner gives an example of a Conservative MP newly elected to Parliament who immediately bought tickets to a Taylor Swift concert to give to a minister because she was a fan, as so many of us are. Should we see that as, as the start of the problem, or is that not really of any great concern when we're thinking about much bigger questions of dark money and digital disinformation? So perhaps we could start with you, Peter, and any of those questions that you would like to respond to.
I think the middle one is a really, really important one about this idea of the limits and the capacities of states to deal with some of these issues and their lopsidedness versus multinationals. We've seen it. Ireland is a very interesting example of this, and you can probably tell from my accent that it's a country I'm quite familiar with. Lots of the big tech companies' headquarters in Europe is in Ireland. And so for example, if you want to sue Facebook, you'll probably end up suing them in Ireland if you're in the United Kingdom. And we have, up until recently, the data protection regulator from Ireland was above a shop in a town called Port Arlington, which is not very far from where I'm from, and is not the centre of the known universe. And it had a tiny little staff. Basically, it was not. You were talking about. It'd be, if I would say David versus Goliath, if there was any chance of David winning, and I think there's a huge mismatch within that. And we've seen even with Mark Zuckerberg in America, his refusal a number of times. Mark Zuckerberg was called to give evidence to Parliament's Department of Select Culture, Media and Sport Select Committee inquiry into these issues, and a number of times Mark Zuckerberg declined. He sent Richard Allen, Lord Allen, the former Lib Dem minister who now works for Facebook alongside Nick Clegg, instead. And I think you get a sense there. In my book I mentioned the Electoral Commission has about 150 staff. Facebook in Britain alone has 3,000. And there's a huge challenge for states to deal with the internationalization of all of these issues. And populism is an internationalized, nationalism has been internationalized in many respects. So it's a cross-border thing. The internet is a huge part of that. And I think there's a huge challenge. It's not just tech companies, I think for lots of other multinationals too, but we are seeing the playing field has become so skewed in their direction that I do think there's limits on what almost any one state can try to do around it. And I think because what's going to happen in other countries is going to impinge on it. And I think that's something that I don't think we kind of have fully grasped, just the size and heft and ability. And just one last point on that. Some interesting email exchanges between Facebook and the then Taoiseach, Leo Varadkar in Ireland were emerged years ago. And it was really interesting because, Leo Varadkar was actually having to be incredibly supplicant to Facebook and basically, asking them, would they please do X, would they please do Y? Because there's a financial incentive as well. You want to keep these companies in your country.
Thank you very much. Margaret, do you want to come in?
If I take the first question, create the political will to tackle corruption. I mean, I'd say two things. I mean, Robert talked about leadership. I do think it's an issue of leadership, but I also think we shouldn't undervalue the role of civil society. Just think, it's not a corruption issue, but just think of Marcus Rashford and the free school meals campaign. If civil society does get itself organized, then it can be incredibly impactful. And so it's really getting this to the top of the agenda. And can I just say, is the state too small? I think this is a really interesting question. But from my tax justice work, I always say, if you wait for international cooperation, you'll never get anywhere. Obviously, you should try and achieve it, and we should work hard at that. But I don't think waiting for international cooperation should stop us taking action at the national level. And finally, on prioritizing, I always worry about these issues because, you know, whether it's tax avoidance or corruption, there is this spectrum. And if you ignore the less offensive side of the spectrum, it very, very quickly morphs into the more offensive side. So, you know, maybe we're asking too much of our system, but I think just saying we'll deal with the really terrible stuff first ignores the fact of how that emerges. So, you know, does it matter that certain people get certain jobs, you know, or doesn't it? And I think we have to have transparency and clear rules around that and revolving doors. I mean, revolving doors is such a simple one to deal with, and I just cannot understand why we haven't legislated in a much tougher way to stop that happening. It just shouldn't happen, full stop.
Thank you. Robert.
Thank you. I'll tackle that petty corruption issue because I think that's quite an interesting one. Again, there's a sort of a widespread perception that petty corruption doesn't happen all that much in the UK. And I think that's linked partly to our sense that corruption as a whole doesn't really happen in the UK, and so petty corruption probably doesn't either. It's worthwhile remembering that the first 3 prosecutions under the Bribery Act of 2010 were all for cases of petty corruption in the UK. So, you know, this happens in this country, and when you're talking about victims, it is often victims, in particular the poorer people in society, who are the victims of petty corruption, the immediate victims, particularly if they're being asked to pay a bribe for a service like access to social housing, for example, that might be, you know, a very real need for them. So I don't think we can ignore petty corruption. The example actually was used in the context of politics, and that I think brings us to the question of standards and norms. And there's a question there in the question list on the Nolan principles as well. I think the Nolan principles are actually critical to this. And, you know, it's quite clear that the government at the moment is more or less bypassing the Nolan principles, you know, for whatever reason. I think Parliament has a very strong role here, actually, in trying to reinforce the Nolan principles. And you know, they are, to me, a critical part of this. And whatever we can do to reinforce their existence and make sure we don't move into a post-Nolan world, which I think is a real threat. You know, I think we do need there to be standards in public life. I think those are about the right standards, but there does need to be a body of senior people reinforcing that, rather than just saying, oh, we're now post-Nolan.
Thank you. We're coming almost to the end of our time, but I'm just going to squeeze in one more round of questions. So if you could be very brief, that would be wonderful. First question, is the solution to these problems stronger judicial oversight of ministers and civil servants, or does that risk politicizing or drawing the courts into political controversy? And secondly, how do we strengthen select committees? To take an example, yesterday, the Public Accounts Committee published a report on the town funds, which is £3.6 billion of public money. And it concluded that the choice of the towns that received money gave, and I quote, every appearance of having been politically motivated, and that the department had failed to hand over documents that set out the rationale for which were chosen. And yet, when the minister responsible, Robert Jenrick, was on the Today programme this morning, he was asked one question on this subject right at the end, which was then cut short by the weather forecast. So how can broadcasters be persuaded to take more of an interest in this? And do select committees need more power to demand the document that they need? And then thirdly, is there one achievable change that you would most like to see that you think would improve the situation with corruption in Britain? So let's reverse the order. Robert, would you like to start us off?
Thank you. So I'll go to the one on select committees, which, though I know that's the natural territory for Margaret, and I'll answer it a bit more broadly, which is about the governance of corruption in the UK. That, you know, our national response to the issue of corruption, as I was indicating, is a little bit driven by the fact that there's an assumption it doesn't really happen in the UK. And so entities that you would expect to have certain powers and the coordination that you would expect to happen simply doesn't happen. And Margaret mentioned the post of the government's anti-corruption champion held by John Penrose. I think he does a great job in the area of beneficial ownership transparency overseas. But actually, we also need a great concentration on corruption within the UK. And that position is a prime ministerial appointment. It reports, we think, to the Prime Minister, though that's not very clear. So, you know, this whole issue about the governance, the architecture in the UK of how we tackle corruption is just not fit for purpose. And it may be that there is stuff around the select committees and, you know, what powers they do and don't have that should feed into that.
Thank you. Peter, do you want to go next?
Yeah, in terms of achievable change, my big thing is I think there's lots of things we could do with our electoral system to try and take money out of politics. You know, if you look at other countries, we have no maximum donation limits. You know, if you look at somewhere like France, I think we could have £10,000 a maximum donation for an individual every year. In Britain, we could match fund that. The state could match fund that to make sure the political parties continue to succeed. You know, to survive, even if they had less kind of big donations coming in. There's lots of achievable things we could do with electoral law to tighten it up, which I think would also make a difference. In terms of how to make people care, how to get broadcasters to care, I do think there's a job of work at times. You know, I look back in the past at some of the scandals that did for ministerial careers, like Liam Fox and Atlantic Bridge, where I felt like lots of different media organizations were running at a story together and really pushing it. I feel like in some ways our media's become quite partisan post the 2016 Brexit referendum. I see some signs of that changing actually in recent weeks and months. I think the issue around cronyism and clientelism and the pandemic, I think, has changed some of that. And I think we need more of that. I think there's a huge need for kind of collective media. I say this as a journalist, to actually take these stories seriously and really run with them and not take that slightly jaded view that I don't think the public shares. I think the public is less jaded than your average news producer in terms of these sort of issues. They are more surprised by these sort of the kind of things we are discussing, because I think a lot of people think it doesn't happen and it shouldn't happen, and there's less of that sense of, I think collectively, if my industry was just to be a little bit less careworn and jaded, that might help.
Thank you. And Margaret?
I'll try very briefly. One is on the select committees. I felt that my authority was really strengthened by the fact that I was elected, because that gave me independence, autonomy, and security of tenure. I was there for the 5 years, and I didn't have to look at the tribal politics. I didn't have to report. You know, I had no relationship with the chief whip or the leader of the Labour Party. I was autonomous. I was elected by the whole House. And that's been undermined by Boris Johnson in that he chose the person to chair the liaison committee, which brings all the select committees together, by choosing Bernard Jenkins. I think that was a really crass, terrible, retrograde step. And we should, I would embed those reforms. And the other thing is, I do think whoever the questioner was talking about access to papers, I've always thought access to papers is really important, although I never wanted to make the process more judicial, which is the other suggestion. I think that would harm it. But on the other things, judicial oversight is necessary, but not sufficient. You know, we have judicial review, but I think that is you need all the other organs of our society to bear down on corruption. And what would be my priority? Transparency. I think the more transparency, the harder it is then to allow malpractice leading to corruption to occur.
Well, thank you to all three of you. I think we could have kept this discussion going for hours. We've still got an enormous number of questions in the chat box, and I'm sorry that we didn't get to more of them. But thank you to everybody who's taken part and for asking questions. And we will be returning to many of these issues in future events. So can I just finish by thanking everyone for coming today, and particularly to our three wonderful panelists, Margaret Hodge, Robert Barrington, and Peter Geoghegan. If we could have a digital drum roll of applause, then that would be thundering across the internet right now. Thanks also to Sophia Cusano, who has produced and organised this event and has kept us all digitally afloat. Just to end with a reminder that our next event will be on Tuesday, the 24th of November at 12 o'clock, when we'll be talking about reform of the House of Lords. And we'll be joined for that event by constitutional expert Lord Philip Norton, Paralympian and life peer Lady Tanni Grey-Thompson, and constitutional titan and hero of the UCL Constitution Unit, Professor Meg Russell. So I'll hope to see many of you back here then, but for now, thank you all for coming and goodbye.